4.6 Part 3, Examples 6 and 7. Should have an S. Alright, so it tells us to find the inverse and the domain of the inverse of f of x equals 2 sine of x plus 1 minus 3, where negative 1 minus pi over 2 is less than or equal to x, less than or equal to negative 1 plus pi over 2. Okay, so this is just like doing finding the inverse of any equation. We're going to follow the same exact steps. And so remember, the step 1 was to replace f of x with y. So now we know we have y equals 2 sine of x plus 1 minus 3. And then the second step we did was we switch x and y. So we got x equals 2 sine of y plus 1 minus 3. And our next step is to solve for y. You know what, I'm going to do that on the top of the next line, I think, here. So step 3, we're going to solve for y. Okay, so in step 2, we said x equals 2 sine of y plus 1 minus 3. So y is trapped inside that parenthesis with the plus 1 that's got the sign as part of it. So let's just get that sign of y plus 1 by itself. So let's add the 3. So x plus 3 equals 2 sine of y plus 1. Then let's divide by the 2. So x plus 3 over 2 equals sine of y plus 1. All right, well, how can I get rid of that sign? Well, remember, if you take the inverse of it, it makes it cancel. So if I take the inverse of this side, then I also have to take the inverse of this side. So now I know I have the inverse sign of x plus 3 over 2 will equal the sign and the inverse sign to cancel, and we have y plus 1. So solve for y still, so subtract the 1. And so we got that inverse sign of the x plus 3 over 2, now that's all together, and then we got that minus 1 equals y. And then step 4 says to let me use a different word because it was switch x and y, I don't want it to be confusing. We're going to replace y with the inverse of f of x. So we have the inverse of f of x is equal to the inverse sign of x plus 3 over 2 minus 1. And so there is our inverse function. Now, to find its domain, remember the domain of inverse sine is negative 1 to positive 1. Well, I'm going to write that as an inequality. Because now, what do we have in the place of x? It's not the inverse sine of x, it's the inverse sine of that fraction there. So we know that negative 1 is less than or equal to x plus 3 over 2, which has to be less than or equal to positive 1. So let's solve for x. Well, get rid of the fraction, so multiply by 2. What you do to 1, you got to do to all. So we have negative 2 is less than or equal to x plus 3, less than or equal to 2. And then I'm going to subtract 3. And so we got negative 5 is less than or equal to x, less than or equal to negative 1. And so there is our domain, or you could have wrote it as negative 5 to negative 1 inclusive. Either one of those would be correct. Okay, so for our last one then, example 7, it's really just like this except for it's dealing with cosine instead of sine. So if you don't have all that down, make sure the video is paused so that you can get it, because I'm about to erase it all. All right, so example 7 says find the inverse and the domain of the inverse of f of x equals 3 cosine of x minus 1 plus 2. So remember, we're finding the inverse. So step 1 says change f of x to become y. So we know we got y equals 3 cosine of x minus 1 plus 2. Step 2 says switch x and y. So x equals 3 cosine of y minus 1 plus 2. And then step 3 says solve for y. So let's move the 2 over. So we have x minus 2 equals 3 cosine of y minus 1. Divide both sides by 3. So x minus 2 over 3 equals cosine of y minus 1. And then the only way to get that y minus 1 out of there is to take the inverse of this side. And what you do to one side, you do to the other. So we're going to take the inverse of cosine of the other side. So we have the inverse cosine of x minus 2 over 3 equals, your inverse cosine, your cosine cancels, so we get y minus 1. Move the 1 to the other side. And so the inverse cosine of x minus 2 over 3 plus 1 equals y. And then remember step 4 is to replace y with the inverse of f of x. So we got the inverse of f of x equals the inverse cosine of x minus 2 over 3 plus 1. So there's our inverse. And now we still have to find the domain. Well, we're talking about inverse cosine. So inverse cosine, just like sine, has a domain from -1 to +1. So let's write it as an inequality. But we don't just have inverse cosine of x now. It's of that x minus 2 over 3. So let's put that there in the middle instead of x. Oops. And let's solve for x now. So get rid of the fraction. So we need to multiply it by 3, which means you're going to multiply everything here, all 3 pieces by 3. So -3 less than or equal to x minus 2 less than or equal to 3. And then we got to add the 2. And so we got -1 less than or equal to x less than or equal to 5, which I'm fine with that. Or you could write it in interval notation. So it'd be -1 to 5 inclusive. Either one of those. All right, guys, so that is the end of 4.6. Woo! We're done with chapter 4. Plan is that you should be working on your assignments. So hopefully you've got most of those done. I am going to send a review that you will need to, you can look at to help you study and prepare for your test on Monday. So come in ready for that test. If you have any problems, contact me. Good luck, guys.